Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 9. So, this will actually be our final lesson for the course, and that's because we're not going to have a lesson, the type of assignment with a lecture and a discussion board post due for module or lesson 10, just as in module/lesson 6 when you turned in your first writing project's final draft, you didn't have a discussion board post due then either. Reason being just to give you plenty of time to work on your final draft and do a really good job with it. So, as I said, this is our final lecture, and I just want to take a minute before we dive into it and thank you for a wonderful quarter. I have really enjoyed reading and engaging with your discussion board posts. I've posed questions that are interesting to me, but the impression I've gotten is that they're also interesting to you. And I've really enjoyed reading what you have to say about these things. I feel like I've learned things from you this quarter. So that's, a professor's dream, and I'm very grateful for this class. What are we doing in lesson 9 then? Well, it's actually going to be a rather short lesson, just one part. I don't want to take up too much of your time because you do have this assignment, but you also have, your rough draft, which is very important. If you can write a really solid rough draft, you'll be in such a good position for success on that final draft due next week. So that's all this lesson is about. It's a quick lesson, and it's about writing your paper. How to do a really good rough draft. And like I said, it will be a very brief, succinct lecture. If you recall in lesson 5, when we went over some of the writing tips for your first major writing project, I spoke not only specifically about that assignment, but also more generally about tips for success with writing, like doing multiple drafts before the rough draft even, for instance, taking time off between drafts, making a conclusion to your first draft, the intro to your second draft, seeking feedback from others, those kinds of things. That was a quick review. We're not going to go over those things in detail because you already got them in lesson 5. And I would recommend reviewing lesson 5 real quickly, at least your notes from that lesson, or kind of quickly going back through the lecture, because those writing tips will help you when you have any major writing assignment. But since I've already gone over those, what we're going to focus on right now is just specifically what am I looking for in this final writing project. And to do that, to facilitate that for our case study here, we're going to look at some examples from the sample papers that are on Canvas. And so what I'll do in this short lecture is put up parts of the assignment sheet, the writing prompt, the instructions for this writing project, and then put up statements, quotations of passages from one of the sample papers and see how they match up. Does this sample paper meet the expectations for the assignment? Why or why not? In which ways does it do a good job? In which ways does it fall short? And ideally, my goal is to model for you what you should be doing in your paper for success on it. And so I want to just kind of finish out that thought, and then we'll get to the main slides and to the examples. But what I want to finish out that thought by saying is, and I've said this before, when I post sample papers and ask you to read them, the goal is to not have you mimic those sample papers really precisely. Don't think of them as formulas or templates where you can plug in your ideas and your information. Rather, they are, like I said a few minutes ago, models, guidelines to give you a glimpse of the type of thing I'm looking for, not the exact thing I'm looking for. So think of them as models, and hopefully they'll just kind of stimulate you, get your creative juices flowing so that you can write a good paper. Just kind of give you an idea of what I'm looking for so that you can have a starting point and you can get rolling. Because sometimes just starting writing can be one of the hardest parts. So I find students have told me that having sample papers helps them get started. But these are by no means perfect papers. There's not really any such thing as a perfect paper. Writing is an imprecise art. So don't emulate them too closely, but use them as models. And right now, I'm going to pick apart one of them so you can see how it is a model for you. All right, so let's recall what I'm asking you to do for this routing project. We have the task statement on the assignment sheet, and it says, take a clear stance on an important real-world issue and analyze a cultural artifact of your choice as evidence to prove your argument. I should probably have prove your argument in bold there. Let's take a minute and break down this sentence more precisely. So this means there are two layers to the paper. One layer is the real world issue, and the other layer is the cultural artifact. So you've probably written researched argumentative papers before. This is not that different from that. I'm just giving you a couple of new wrinkles, you could say, or new layers to the very traditional researched argument paper to help you really learn how to write in college, how to do some critical thinking at a very high level. And so most of the researched argumentative papers you've done before probably asked you to take a stance on a real world issue. For instance, global warming is real and we need to put a stop to it. That would be an example of a stance on a real world issue. The dynamic I'm adding here that's probably new to you is the cultural artifact piece, because you need evidence. Anytime you make an argument, you need evidence to prove it. Just as when Poirot puts forward who he thinks the killer is, he needs evidence to back that up. You need evidence to back up your stance. So in this case, in this paper, what is the evidence? It's your analysis of this cultural artifact. And what is a cultural artifact? Pretty much anything, as we've talked about before, something emblematic of the culture in which we're currently living. So a movie, a book, a TV show, a comic book, a video game, a social media post, a meme, a painting, really whatever you want, something that's emblematic of our current culture, and that through your analysis, what you tell us about this artifact will show to readers why they should agree with your stance. You'll be able to make them into believers of your argument by your analysis of this artifact. Now, one thing you might be thinking is, in the past, when I've written research analysis papers, the research was the evidence. It can be and it should be, and there is a place in this paper for research, and we will talk about the proper place. But one thing that's really important in making the transition from pre-college to college writing so that you're prepared to write in other classes at your university is not just repeating what the research has said. And so by asking you to use a cultural artifact as your evidence, essentially, you could say, kind of almost forcing you to go beyond just repeating what the research has said, because some of this is like mix and match. You're matching up a cultural artifact with your real world issue. And so a lot of the research out there might not necessarily talk about those two things in conjunction. So by throwing the cultural artifact dynamic into the mix, I'm therefore, kind of, like I said, making you do something a little more creative and original than just taking a stance on the issue and using the research to back it up. So the other question you probably have then is, if that's what you're doing on this assignment, where does the research fit into it? Because you still have to have the research. If the research isn't backing up what I say, if my analysis of my artifact is backing up what I say, what the heck do I do with this research? We will talk about that in just a minute. Before we do that, before we talk about where the research goes, now that we've got the basic premise in front of us, let's start going through a sample paper and looking at how well this particular student does some of these things I'm asking for. And when we get to the research part, we'll talk about that in more detail then. So, to sum up, you have to make an argument about a real-world issue and you have to use as your evidence your own analysis of some kind of text. You've matched up with your artifact. You think this text exemplifies the point you're making. Okay, so let's take a look at this student sample paper. They have a really solid intro, and they have some general background. Remember, you don't want to start with the thesis. You want the thesis to be the last sentence in your intro. So they have some real general background, and then they get to their thesis. Let's take a look at their thesis. Animal mental health is just as important as human mental health. Therefore, the both of us should be mentally supported, stimulated, and allowed to live lives of happiness and freedom as a basic right, and not be used for someone else's monetary gain. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of this thesis? This is the point where I encourage you to pause the lecture and jot down some notes. Like, what do you see as the strengths? What do you see as the weaknesses? And not just listing them, but next to your list, write why. Not just the word why, but answer the question why. Why is this a strength? Why is this a weakness? And to answer that question, you have to know what makes something a good thesis or not. You have to have some criteria for your evaluation. So take a minute, jot down what you think is a strength here, what you think is a weakness here, and next to that, write why it's a strength or why it's a weakness. And in your mind, or you can write this down too, like what makes something a strength or a weakness. Like, why do we have a certain criterion for evaluation? Okay, so go ahead and give that a shot. Now, here are the things I came up with. You can see how well they mesh up with what you came up with. The strengths would be, it's a clear stance with supporting reasons and an important topic, a real-world issue. So, this issue of how animals are treated very much qualifies as a real-world issue, something important and worth writing about. So, and you can check off that box. The student has met that part of the prompt. Remember, there's 2 layers, so they've met the real-world issue layer. There's a clear stance. A lot of people would disagree with this. The student is arguing that humans and animals should both be mentally supported, stimulated, and allowed to live lives of happiness and freedom as a basic right. That's a polarizing argument to a degree. There are people who think it's not problematic for animals to be locked up in captivity. This student's arguing the opposite, so it's a clear stance. And she gives some supporting reasons. It doesn't just follow the such and such because structure, but there's still, if you look at this closely, clear supporting reasons here. Primarily being animal health is just as important as human mental health. If one accepts that statement as true, then that's a very compelling supporting reason. So you have a stance, a reason why on a real-world issue. So in terms of the most basic requirements, looking at the assignment prompt, this thesis definitely meets those requirements. But I said no paper is perfect. No thesis is perfect. So what might be some of the limitations or weaknesses of this thesis? One that I identified is this is a fairly difficult argument to prove. And why do I say that? Well, because there will be some readers out there who just think animals should not have any rights, that don't see animals and humans as equal. And so you will have some readers who do really support animal rights, and they'll see this as mental health as adding a new interesting dynamic to that conversation and be very on board with this. And they'll enjoy reading it, and they might learn something new, but they won't really need to be persuaded. And then you'll have people who will say, they're just not concerned about animal rights. I don't think they deserve to have rights. And you're probably not going to convince those people. So the question remains then, should the student write this paper? And I say yes, most definitely. I think there are some people, enough people in the middle, For instance, you might have people who aren't huge advocates of animal rights. They're not, for instance, vegetarians. But when you frame the issue in this way, you start talking about mental health, how these animals are feeling and doing, that person might be compelled enough. They might not be so compelled to say stop eating meat, but that's not the goal of the student's paper. The goal is to get people to see how animals are treated at certain places like SeaWorld. And maybe you end up changing someone's perspective on that. So it's certainly a topic worth pursuing, and I think the student does a good job of articulating it here. But just noting that if your main reason is animal mental health is just as important as human mental health, that is a fairly difficult argument to prove to everyone, because there are going to be some readers who have already made up their mind that those things are not equally important. And you're not going to convince them otherwise. Now, with that said, this is a weakness, not something that completely stops the paper. So I think the student could reframe this a bit and not say animal health is just as important as mental health, but point out, more just kind of pointing out that people probably don't often think about animals' mental health, and it is a factor in the equation when we think about supporting places like SeaWorld. So maybe qualifying the argument a little bit, not making it as extreme as these things are co-equal, that might reach even more readers. So definitely some clear strengths here, definitely some weaknesses, hopefully a helpful model, both by seeing the strengths and the weaknesses, hopefully a helpful model of a thesis for you. How about the cultural artifact, right? I didn't see any mention of a cultural artifact there. Well, the very next sentence at the start of the next paragraph goes like this: Blackfish, a documentary written and directed by Gabriel Capotherwaite, triggered a crisis for SeaWorld after its release, which caused tremendous financial losses due to public outrage. So we've got a clear cultural artifact in the very next sentence. So this might get you to ask, do I need to mention my cultural artifact in my thesis? And there's no right or wrong answer to this. Yes, it's great. It depends on the topic and the paper you're writing. So I'm fairly flexible as an instructor. I give you a certain ideal structure for the paper, but then beyond that, you have the freedom, you have the wiggle room, depending on your topic and your artifact and the flow of your paper. There's not hard and fast rules in every aspect of the structure. And so this is a good example of, you could mention the artifact in the thesis, but you don't absolutely have to. Do what works best for you. All right, so now we get to that question about research that we wanted to answer a few minutes ago. And if you recall from the last lesson, I talked about what you're really going to do with the research. The research isn't backing up your argument. Your analysis of your cultural artifact is backing up your argument. So what is the research doing? It is showing why your argument is relevant and important. It's contextualizing it. It's situating it. Think of walking into a messy room, and everything has a place where it needs to go. And you're cleaning up the room, and maybe you find a box that just doesn't seem to fit anywhere. And then all of a sudden you realize where it goes, and that piece fits in. That's what the research does for your argument. It frames it. It creates that spot for you to place your unique thesis, your unique argument there. So what you do is you talk about the research early on in the paper, after your intro, and before you get to the in-depth analysis of the artifact. This nice little space there between the intro and the main body of the paper, where you can spend a paragraph or a few paragraphs even talking about your research and using it to contextualize, to frame your argument. And so how do you take the research and present it in a way that frames your argument, creates that place for your argument? How do you do that? Well, you've got these different pieces of research that are each kind of there on their own. What you have to do is, we talked about in the last lecture, is what we call either synthesis or syntopical writing. Though we talked about syntopical reading, hopefully you've done syntopical reading when you were doing your research and finding those resources. And so you've made connections between the resources. Now it's time to show those connections to your reader and to add one more connection, which is the connection to your argument. So you can connect, synthesize the research to show the reader, this is what people generally think about this topic. And then you can show how your argument is unique. You can say, however, people haven't really thought of this yet. So I'm adding this idea to that conversation. I'm filling this gap. So now that we've got that established, let's take a look at an example of it. So at the end of a long second paragraph, the student in the sample paper says, while each of these articles spend the much deserved time discussing the immorality and ethics of keeping orcas captive, they all fall short and fail to focus on the true effect this behavior had on these mammals. They ignore how this impacted the mental health of Tilikum and other whales, which is the real issue at large. So if you read the whole second paragraph, I'm not quoting the whole second paragraph, you'll see that the student does a very good job of taking a look at 3 articles, just as I've asked you to look at 3 articles, and paraphrasing in her own words, quoting some too, but always after the quote, paraphrasing in her own words, never relying just on the quote, though each of those arguments. And all of those arguments show the immorality and ethics. So in the first half of this sentence, just the first half of the sentence where the student talks about immorality and ethics, she has synthesized the arguments of all 3 articles. She's saying all 3 articles deal with this. So summing up 3 long articles in half a sentence. It's a great example, a really good example of syntopical writing. But then in the second half of the sentence, she says they all fall short. That phrase indicates there's something missing. And she says they ignore how this impacted the mental health of Tilikum. So the research covers lots of problems with keeping orcas captive, but none of these particular pieces of research address the mental health of the whale. So she's saying, here's a new idea, a new wrinkle, a new dynamic, something she, in her specific thesis, is adding to this conversation. So here we have, that messy room. We have these different things kind of floating about the room, these different points about different ways keeping orcas is immoral or unethical. And then we've got this box, the student's unique piece, that is mental health of animals. And where does that go? Well, after organizing the room, synthesizing the different pieces, that point about mental health fits right in. And then not only does the student have a clear context for her argument, she's shown the readers how her argument is unique. She's not just repeating what the researcher said, but doing something new that builds on the foundation laid by these other researchers. So this closing sentence of the second paragraph here is a really great example of syntopical writing and the kind of writing I'm looking for you to do when you incorporate the research in your paper. One question you might have about this is, what about the rest of that paragraph? I just looked at the last sentence. Well, one thing you can do that I would say this student doesn't do as much as she could is make connections between the sources throughout the paragraph. She mainly paraphrases them on their own and doesn't connect them till that final sentence. So let's real quickly take a little bit of a detour and look at some examples from 2 of the other sample papers, the other 2 ones, and see what they do, because throughout that second paragraph, they do make connections between their sources. So what do some of those sentences look like? Well, one of them from sample paper 2 says, these ideas are echoed in. So you've got a paraphrase of one article, and then to transition to talking about the next article, the student says, these ideas are echoed in. So that next article says something really similar. And so you've got a connection there. That's what we call a synthesis or a syntopical statement because it's showing how two pieces, the two articles, are connected. Here's another one from sample paper 3. Two established researchers, Marina Fiore and John Antonock, may agree. So basically saying the same thing. The two authors of this next article agree with the previous article. So think about this as you go. As you write the couple of paragraphs or the paragraph after the intro before the body, where you synthesize your research and do some topical routing, think about what are the similarities, what are the differences between these articles. And as you paraphrase each article, point out those connections, ultimately building up to, at the end of the paragraph, a statement like we saw on the previous slide where you, in one sentence, it could be a few sentences, but in a short space, you outline what all the articles have in common and what you are adding to that. So we've got the intro and what we call the synthesis or the literature review section down, where you do some topical writing. Now we just have left to talk about, and then we'll be done, body paragraphs, the meat, the majority of the paper. What should a body paragraph be structured like? Talked about this in lesson 5, but we're going to review it here, then look at a specific example, and then we'll wrap up this lecture. So you need a topic sentence. The first sentence in the paragraph should state an argument. If you just say Blackfish is a movie that came out in such and such year, that doesn't tell me what the paragraph is about. You've got your overall argument. You need to have 2, 3, 4, something like that, little mini arguments supporting your main argument. What is the argument of this specific paragraph? If it's an argument, you probably need a little bit of background and context for the reader to understand it. Not always, but often. So after the topic sentence, you can add another sentence or two that gives a little clarification of the ideas, some background and context. Then you need your evidence. So this could be an example or a quote from the artifact. If it's a film or a show or a video game, you might just kind of paraphrase what happens. If it's a book or something, it might be a little easier to quote, but you need some evidence. Here's the most important part. You analyze several sentences that should say explain, several sentences that explain how the evidence proves the argument from the topic sentence. So, in other words, if you just quote or just give the example and then move on, you have not proven your argument. You need to show the reader, illustrate to the reader how the evidence proves the argument. So this should be the bulk of the paragraph. 2, 3, 4, definitely more than one sentences that basically sometimes we call these linking sentences. So basically connects the example or the evidence to the argument from the topic sentence. Finally, it's nice to have a concluding statement that ties your ideas together before moving on. Because if you have 3 or 4 sentences of analysis, you're making some points, some connections, taking your reader through your logical thought process. You don't want to just end with your last point. It won't feel very cohesive. So if you think about the conclusion to a paper, if you can do the same type of thing, but in one sentence for each individual paragraph, that'll give your paragraph a nice cohesive feel before you move on. Finally, remember that the topic sentences, or the ideas from them at least, are proving your thesis. And that connection may seem implicit or obvious to you. It will not be to your reader, because your reader is not living inside your head. So you need to state it explicitly. What is the connection between the point you're making here and your thesis? You can do this in the topic sentence, the concluding statement, throughout your analysis, wherever it seems to fit. There's not an exact place always. It depends on your paper and the topic of this particular paragraph. But you need to make that connection clear. If these paragraphs are really great paragraphs on their own, but a reader unfamiliar with your subject matter can't see how they prove your thesis, you haven't done your job fully. So keep that in mind. All right, I've picked one paragraph from the sample paper. Let's go through that and see how it does these things. talking topic sentence. After watching the documentary Blackfish, it wouldn't be unrealistic to draw parallels to the human prison system and the mental health decline of inmates. So, what are the strengths? It's a clear argument. A comparison between, the prison system and SeaWorld is definitely an argument. Some would disagree. It uses the cultural artifact. It's talking about the documentary Blackfish, and it connects to the thesis because that keyword is mental health. Mental health is what we call a connecting thread. It's what ties this whole paper together. You don't want your paragraphs to feel like islands. You want the whole paper to be cohesive. So if you have some kind of idea or some kind of thread that connects everything, ties it all together, just using that phrase can be the connection to your thesis. That's what, mental health does here. Does this topic sentence have any weaknesses? Only major thing I can see is you should avoid contractions in academic writing. Say would not instead of wouldn't. It looks more professional. There's other things, but I don't want to take the time to go into them right now. Remember, these are models, not ideal examples. All right, how about some background and context? That's a pretty bold claim. We probably need to kind of situate that claim a little before analyzing the evidence. So background and context. Prison is a melting pot of individuals from different places and backgrounds, all held in one place against their free will. While the difference is that they are a detriment to society and there needs to be a place for those people of the world, their mental health is still looked after with psychiatrists and medication. Tillicum was just a whale minding his own business and enjoying his day with his family. When he was kidnapped and sold into slavery, he didn't do anything to deserve this. So these first couple sentences here are really helpful. Because someone might say, okay, you can't compare prisoners to whales. But some of the issues that person might have would be alleviated by some of these sentences potentially, right? Because she does acknowledge that people are in prison because they've committed a crime. She acknowledges that in the second sentence. She's saying even though they've committed a crime, their mental health is still important. Psychiatrists and doctors still look after them. They receive medication and food, etc. And so if we say the mental health of people who have committed crimes is important, why wouldn't the mental health of animals who haven't committed crimes be important? And so, again, a lot of readers may not see people and animals as being on equal footing, but those people and other readers probably don't also see, convicted criminals and non-criminals on equal footing. And so this becomes a much more reasonable and compelling argument and then a couple sentences after the topic sentence than it initially seemed like. And so with other arguments, you may not need this much background and context, but here we see the importance of giving just a little bit of background and context. The analysis should be the bulk of the paragraph, but some background and context is important in many cases. All right, evidence. Blackfish makes an argument for when Tillicum was thrown into this new environment with whales from all over the world that he couldn't communicate with them, as each whale family has its own language. Those communication barriers were part of the reason he was severely beaten up, rammed and racked by the other whales, which left him bloody, confused, and visibly upset. So because the student's analyzing a movie, she doesn't quote from it, though she could have, but instead describe something that happened. So this is not analysis. This is summary. This is just telling you, the reader, what happens in the film. But then turn to analysis, we see why those things the student describes from the film prove the argument in her topic sentence. She makes the connection when she says, the trainers would essentially act as prison guards and would separate them when this happened, leading to a further decline in Tillicum's mental health, as solitary confinement also does for humans. The difference between human prisons and Tillicum is that Tillicum had no mental health support or outlets to keep his brain healthy in a good place mentally. So by saying the trainers would act like prison guards, she's doing some analysis here, breaking down, right? You've got the description of how the whale is treated by the trainers, and then she's going into detail to explain this treatment is similar to what happens in prisons. And so that's that leap, that transition from summary to analysis. This is not a description of what happens in the film. This is a student's reflection on what happens in the film, what she thinks about it. So here you have analysis, and clearly there's a connection to the topic sentence because this prison-like treatment hinders the mental health. So you've got the connection to the topic sentence and the thesis established through this analysis of the evidence from the documentary. And how does the student wrap up the paragraph? Captivity and solitary confinement do not lead to positive mental stimulation and does not allow for happiness or enjoyment in life, which contributes to more mental problems. So it sums up captivity and solitary confinement are two different things she brings up throughout the context and the evidence and the analysis. But they all come back to this idea that bad for mental health. So she ties everything together and basically restates her topic sentence while tying together those different things. So some flaws, but overall you have really an ideal body paragraph here in terms of you've got the argument, the context, the evidence, the analysis, and it's all tied together in that final statement. So that's what I have for you as a sample. A couple last things I'll say. One is that if you were analyzing something this student did like SeaWorld, the film Blackfish would be a very obvious cultural artifact, and it's fine to go with something obvious. But I want to encourage those of you who may not have something like that in mind, that less obvious connections are welcome and encouraged too. So if you're matching up certain things that aren't perhaps as obvious as this, that's great. And I think the other two sample papers really do that. Gender issues in James Bond films, emotional intelligence in Marvel superheroes. Those are some good examples of what you can do mixing and matching with real world issues and cultural artifacts. And as always, if you have any questions about your topic choice, please let me know what they are. Email me or come to my Zoom office hours. I'd love to talk to you about your ideas and help you with them. So finally, how am I going to tie it all together to end our class? Make me a believer, the name of the class. The goal is to make your readers a believer in your argument. How do you do that? Channel your inner Poirot when you present your evidence. So the way Poirot presents everything to his audience, and then all of a sudden they're convinced this person they never suspected was the killer, that's what you're doing here. The only difference is Poirot saves the reveal of the killer to the end because that's a mystery. And if you found out the killer earlier on, it wouldn't be as exciting. But in academic writing, you want to lead with your argument. You want your thesis at the end of the intro, not anywhere later in the paper than the intro, and you want your arguments of your paragraphs in that very first sentence of each paragraph so that you have clear topic sentences. But when you get to your evidence and your analysis, be Hercule Poirot, because he makes people into believers. Whatever you're writing about, I may not care about it yet, but by the time I'm done reading your paper, hopefully you can make me a believer. Thank you for a great quarter. Like I said at the start, I've had a blast. If you've enjoyed this class anywhere near as much as I did, then you really enjoyed it. So thank you for your time, your participation. I wish you the best of luck with your finals.